What is it that Cicero was looking around and seeing as like the problem if you fail to grasp this finitude, and I would just say, and you, Mike, as you look around the world, where is it that you're like, this is where we could use a dose of that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's the grind set mindset. I look around and I see striving everywhere. I say that as somebody, by the way, who grabbed a brass ring at a young age and got everything I ever wanted. But I don't see everybody else grabbing the brass ring and being happy with it. I see a lot of people striving and not getting what they want. And Cicero says the exact same thing, or Pseudo-Cicero, in this very book that you're saying. There's a section in there, he says, a lot of people reach the end of life and they have assumed it's going to go on forever. And they freak out at the very end. They've never actually paused to think it can't last forever. We've never seen anybody live beyond this. So I think that is one of the interesting points of contact, and the talking about the values of life and how we want to reset them. I wanted to talk about an issue, though, that I thought came up at the very beginning of your book, and see if maybe you could expand on it, because it's an issue that means a lot to me as a classics professor, and it's the medicalization of life, or the medicalization of death. And I don't know if you even know this term, right? I don't think I had heard it in college, the medicalization. I used it once in my administrative role, and people start raising eyebrows. I said, relax. I'm not making words up. But you talk, when people cling to life at all costs, what does that mean, right? What are we going to do to try and save somebody's life? And this is what I think it's your opening anecdote in the book. It's really gripping. I haven't stopped thinking about it since I read it. Because you can bring people back to life, can't you? My great Latin teacher, they brought him back to life 3 times.
Yeah, well, that's what we try to do. I actually was talking about this recently in the hospital with a room full of residents, so junior doctors, and I said, how many, I told them the story of attempting resuscitation on that gentleman 3 times, the patient, the story I tell, and one of the young doctors raised her hand. She said, Dr. Dugdale, I attempted resuscitation 7 times in the same night on the same person. So this person died 7 times and was successfully resuscitated, well, however the math, 6 times. The 7th resuscitation was a failure. But yeah, I mean, I can riff on that if you want me to. But.
Well, because you talk about what does that mean, right? Like a lot of people are like, wow, I don't want to die, right? Like if you can bring me back to life, that would be amazing. But you write about what that entails. So you have to break people's ribs. The quality, you might get an extra hour out of one of these resuscitations as opposed to preparing to die a dignified death. The Cicero book actually talks about that. He talks about people who would have been happier had they died before they saw some of these things. And so there's a point made in the book where he says, if you want to see what makes somebody happy, you have to look at the entire career. You have to look at the end. Because a lot of people, careers, they end badly. Almost every leadership position ends badly. If you ever look at politicians, it's always a failure at the end. So some people would be better off stopping shy of getting those goals. And so I just thought it was really profound what you talk about, because you have to talk to families, I think this is what you write, who say, no, we want you to try anything it takes to save our loved one, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, so what medicine has made possible is not only dodging these questions that Cicero was asking and that we're asking, but medicine has now added the veneer of making basically death optional. Because we have technology that can really maintain the vital functions of human bodies almost indefinitely. I don't know, I won't ask if anybody in here is squeamish. I'm going to assume no one is. But there are people in my hospital right now that are literally decomposing inside as we maintain their vital functions on life support. They are still alive, but they're actively dying. But patients or families or the state in New York, if a patient doesn't have anyone to represent them, the state is very strict about we have to do everything we can to maintain life if there's a possibility of survival to discharge. So maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room in that last category, but often we'll have patients or their families insisting on using the apparatus of medicine until well beyond the point that there's any possibility this medicalization doing any good at all. It won't lead to survival, and it's really so. Then the question becomes, well, where's the line between dragging out the dying process and prolonging life? And when you get to the dragging out the dying process and you're no longer prolonging life in a meaningful way, that's where a lot of doctors sort of try to talk to families about holding back. But I'll also say this. I have many physician colleagues who themselves are afraid to talk to patients about their dying. Because there are many doctors, even though they see death routinely, they have not ever sat with these questions either. They have never come to a place of peace in their own answers to life's big questions. And so there's one of my colleagues said to me, I don't even know why you write books about death, and I don't know why you talk to patients about death. She said, I am so afraid to die. I do everything I can to avoid telling my patients when they're dying. And this is a primary care doctor. If your primary care doctor is not going to tell you, who's going to tell you? So medicalization has only sort of reified or reinforced the idea that we don't need to think about these questions of ultimacy.
Yeah. Can I make that's why it's bracing to read the extreme cases. But an issue that I have noticed over the course of my adult life is the medicalization of all of our unhappiness. And I bet that's going to resonate with some people in the room. That's an American point of view. It's a recent point of view. But so we're going to medicalize away the end of life, but are we medicalizing away some of the big questions in connection with the grind set mindset, right? We're going to work. So how are we going to work and keep working? We keep taking substances. It's going to allow us to keep going. I'm shocked when people tell me some of the things they're taking to write a term paper for my class. I say, no, we can find a better way. And I'm sure there's much more of that kind of thing happening.
But also the elimination of disability, too. So, we can run genetic profiles on fetuses in utero and then decide which lives we don't think are worth living. But what does it do when, there's a beautiful article in The Atlantic, which I commend to you, I think in 2015, on the disappearance of Down syndrome. And that's part of the medicalization. In a sense, it's sort of a, what do they say, like positive eugenics, right? Or maybe it's a negative eugenics, because you're eliminating the fetuses that would go on to be babies and children who have the disabilities, because then we can be more productive, right? We can go into the grind more, because then as a mother or a father, I'm not constrained by having to care for a child who's very dependent on me. So I agree. We were talking a little bit about organ transplantation over dinner too. I mean, we are medicalizing every aspect of life.
Maybe we can move into even further away from the end of life kind of situations that you have in hospital to like the more general kind of problems and projects that we have in our lives. So because your book does a really nice job of illustrating a kind of mindset, which looks exactly like the grind set mindset, that is really kind of fatal or toxic. When it comes into like, now you have this advanced medical technology, you can just be like, we're going to beat this cancer. We're going to just keep going. And you're in denial about like the finitude and the recognition. If you work backwards, let's talk about the good case. Suppose you have someone who's like, okay, I want to start differently. So how would you have us do it? So if I were a student, I'd want to say a little bit like in favor of the grind set right here and be like, okay, that's fine for end of life, great. But I got to get through this year and this semester, and I got some papers and exams coming up. And I got to stick with this. How would the traditions you've studied counsel like rethinking my choices today? Like what should I be doing now? Not just for my end of life planning in my like living will, but like also for like out beyond that.
Well, that's not a small question, but yeah, so how are you going to fix it? I mean, number one, I wouldn't change anything right now as we sit over the dinner table, but what do you want? Are you at Cornell so that you can get into grad school of some kind? The answer to that question is usually yes. Say, all right, why do you want to go to grad school? So I can get the job doing X. All right, that's great. Why do you want the job doing X? So I can make a lot of money and have a prestigious job. I'm not against any of that, by the way. I think that stuff's great. But so why do you want a lot of money? That's where things start. You don't get beyond that question too often because it's taken as a given that a lot of money is a good thing. In fact, people who study this, they say that, you may already know this, a lot of money to a certain degree is a good thing. You don't want to be poor. Being poor is not a good idea. But being phenomenally rich doesn't really make you happy either. You got to have a minimum number. The last time I saw the minimum number, it was 75 grand a year. That was probably 10 years ago, so it's going to be beyond that today. But making $2 million a year, $5 million, I'll take it. But what am I going to do with it? I'm going to put it in the bank, and I'm not going to do anything different than I'm doing now. So you want to try and find a partner in life who shares these values, assuming most of you want to partner up in life. So you got to keep thinking, what's the next thing? And then what do you want to do to get there, right? Are you unhappy now? I get the sense that a lot of people at Cornell are a bit unhappy because they're studying all the time or they're in their silos, and that might cause you to reassess your priorities and start changing some things that you're doing.
Okay, so I have a very different take on this, and I kind of have too many things in my head right now. Okay, so let me start with this. I will say that I think there are seasons to work really hard. And so you just don't make it through medical school if you don't work really hard. You don't make it through your term papers if you don't sit down and write the thing, right? So there are seasons to put in the work. And then there's the question of calling, which we talked about a bit over dinner. And this people make sense of in different ways, but do I have a deep sense that what I am doing matters in the big scheme, whether because it will translate into a life of service or a life of teaching, or it will allow me to invest in communities or whatever. How does what I am doing, how do I have a sense of purpose in what I am doing? Because if there is a sense of purpose or mission or call, the idea that you would work really hard at that isn't quite the same as, I just want to get the job at Goldman Sachs and just make bank and like live the good life, right? There's very different ways. So how is, whether it's calling, whether it's a religious or secular notion of calling, or meaning or purpose, how does those sorts of questions, how does that lens help you make sense of where you're at? And in part, college is kind of a season, and maybe it leads to something, but asking the questions about meaning and purpose in your goals with college and grad school or beyond, first job, I think are really important. So there's that stuff. I want to say it's okay to work really hard for seasons, but it is important to be aware that seasons have their limits. Thinking about meaning and purpose and calling is really critical. But then there's this sort of third camp, which I thought you were going to go to. So since I'm a non-classicist, I'm going to riff on it anyway. We talk a lot with the medical students about cultivating virtues. Which another way you could think of them are good habits of character, good character traits. In medicine, we talk a lot about solidarity with patients, honesty, being a technically competent physician. It's not quite a virtue, but there's space for that, right? So what kind of person am I becoming? Am I a person of courage, of integrity? Do I live an integrated life where the kind of doctor I am in the hospital and the kind of professor I am in the medical school and the kind of mom I am at home, that there's an integrity there that doesn't just go away when I don or doff my white coat, right? And so I think all of us can be attending now to how we cultivate these various virtues so that when we meet difficulty, we are equipped to respond, because we cannot control suffering, right? Then somebody said life is to live is to suffer. Maybe that was Nietzsche. To live is to suffer. But we can choose how we can respond to suffering, and cultivating virtue, a life of virtue, helps us respond to suffering, I think in a better, healthier, more robust way.
So I agree with all that, and I put it in a much more stark fashion. I've got a friend here in town who's made some pretty poor choices in life. He's my friend, though, and he told me something years ago I've never forgotten. He said, "You don't get it, Mike." He said, "Most people can't look themselves in the mirror without flinching." I've never forgotten that. He said, "You sleep well at night, so you don't understand." He said, but there's so much misery out there, people who can't sleep well at night. How do you do this? You cultivate the classical virtues. Some of you may have heard of these. There were 4 in the classical tradition. You'll find, so there are going to be some Stoic fans out here. There's always Stoic fans in a crowd. Stoics, Platonists, everybody in the ancient world cultivated these, and they wound up within Christianity. The 4 classical virtues were wisdom, justice, fortitude, which is a way of saying courage or endurance, and moderation. The 4th is probably most important. That's what they usually say. Moderation, reasonableness, limits, of that kind of thing. And when you can approach a decision you have to make with those 4 criteria, you can sleep well at night. You can look at yourself in the mirror.
I have to tell you a story. I like writing books on death. I like to read stories about really old people. And I read a story in the newspaper about a really old lady, and somebody said, how did you live to be whatever, 100 and something? And she said, every night when I got ready for bed, I would ask myself if I had any regrets. And I would take care of it before I went to bed. So every night went to bed with no regrets. And in a way, that's like a mini finitude, right? You're saying this is the limit. Everything has to be resolved every night. I need to have peace with my neighbors, whatever, right? My mini finitude is every night. Actually, the Catholic tradition, I'm sure there's somebody Catholic here. There's something called I think it's called like the evening examen, or the examen, where every night before bed you sort of reflect on your day and kind of take care of that. So I think that's what this lady was doing, kind of the nightly examen.
So I want to try and get a sense of where you might diverge too, because so far we've been in kind of too much agreement. You need to start getting to some places where you actually disagree. So one of the ways I think is you have this sharp divide when you think about total like human projects of life and mortality, of thinking about, well, what's past it? Mm-hmm. And that's a really like kind of thorny one, because it's like that might have make a difference, might have some impact in how you think about what the projects are right here, given that. And it can go in multiple directions, not always well. I mean, you can have a lot of problems in both directions, I think. But maybe you could speak a little bit. So, for example, in your book, you've talked a little bit about, say, the largest religious category fastest growing one, like a spiritual but not religious kind of view, which is something you see and you've kind of noticed some things about it. I don't know if you want to say about how does that impact end of life kind of thought. And then you can actually, let's hear Lydia first, and then we'll kind of take from there.
Yes, I think we diverge before we get to the end of life, and that is the question of whether we are sort of masters of our own lives or whether we are responding to a master of our life. So in the Christian tradition, and I'm a practicing Christian, there's this idea that life comes from God, that sort of God is the author and creator of life. And therefore, we can choose to live sort of aligned with God, or we can kind of choose our own adventure, you know? And it might be a perfectly good adventure. Actually, this reminds me of a line by C.S. Lewis, who says something about we are so content, we're like children in the slums, so content making mud pies in the sand while there is, a beach holiday awaiting us, right? So there's a way in which I think in the Christian tradition, one could say that, yeah, you can actually create for yourself a very good life. It could be a very good life, but it is always going to be mud pies compared to the beach holiday. If it is not aligned with the sort of best life, sunum bonum. How's my Latin?
Very good.
All right. I'm a wannabe. If it's not the sunum bonum that God has for us, and so then part of the Christian experience is trying to discern. Am I sort of aligned or not aligned with what I'm trying to figure out is God's will for my life? And people have all different ways of sort of tackling that question. So I don't know where you come down on that, but we may diverge even right here on the questions of the good life.
That's right. The ancients, before Christianity, had no conception of what you just described. There's no such thing as a personal relationship with God. There are gods, and they talk extensively, and some people believe in them. Many people believe in them. Others do not, so there are atheists in the ancient world as well. So the the ancients don't have this idea of aligning with God in any particular way, but they do have this idea of choosing your priorities given that God is not part of the equation, right? So, for example, we were talking over dinner, Stoicism, some of you are familiar with, their idea, they believe in intelligent design. This is an argument that's usually attributed to Christianity. It's a Stoic idea. They have this idea of God's plan, whatever it means. They call it providence, but it was the idea that something has been set in motion, and you can buck against it, but you may not get what you want. But then when you get away from that, you get into the Platonic tradition. That's what Cicero was sort of a follower of. And Plato has a definite notion of heaven and being with the gods and so forth. But if you don't believe that you're going to have the kind of Christian conception of heaven, then it becomes what happened? What are you going to do with your life now? Right? What if that is the end? And Cicero and others talk about this. What if everything just stops when we die? Cicero's answer was to look around. For him, it was community, to build up your state, to be a great politician, to serve others. It's going to all sound very Christian in the values, which doesn't mean Cicero was a Christian. He did some things not too Christian, but like he executed a bunch of people. However, but you can have values. And you see this in another tradition called Epicureanism. Some of you may know this as well. Epicureanism became it's the predecessor of the secular humanist lifestyle. Thomas Jefferson and Karl Marx are the two most famous Epicureans of modern times. And their answer was, if there's nothing after death, and we think there is nothing, we have to have community right here, right now. And so community, we're going to create our own communities, we're going to work and serve each other and so forth. But when you're not oriented toward the same summum bonum, it's interesting to me because the lifestyles don't, in the end, look all that different, even though they're headed in presumably very different places at the end.
Well, presumably, though, there's going to be some kind of transcendence to that project, right? So whatever your community that you're trying to build, and Marx is a nice example where it's like, well, actually, there's a really large community that you're trying to build, and that becomes the super kind of like transcendent thing, which will live on past your death, right?
That's exactly right. So Marx is probably, I hope they're teaching you. Marx thought that we need to improve material conditions right here, right now. That's all there is. There's not going to be anything else. So if we can't make people's lives better now, make them richer, we're failing the human race. Now, we probably debate how well that worked out with his idea. But that was Marx's take. Thomas Jefferson, same thing. They thought that the United States would be this new Enlightenment project. We're going to make people happy in the here and now and this sort of thing.
But reading Cicero, I think one thing that to admire maybe is a kind of courage, right? Of like, you know what, if that's what the world is, if that's what reality is like, then face it with some courage and, don't like rely on a kind of wishful thinking of something else. So maybe to speak in favor of that sort of courage might be one divergence of...
Let me think, because the Christian virtue is going to be humility, I think. That's completely alien to the ancient world, especially the Roman world. It's all braggadocio in the Roman world because you live in public. Some of you read the Iliad, right? The goal in the Iliad is to have your name echo forever and ever through the ages. The word for glory in Greek is related to the word of calling on somebody's name, kleos. And so that's very different, right? And how do you align with that? Like I said, it sounds very different, but if you want your name to be remembered, you can do great works for other people. I don't think it's all that different from the Christian ideal at the end of the day.
It might look the same, but the motivation is different, right?
Oh yes, for sure. I mean, there's no question of getting into heaven.
So the posture of the heart. I think it's also important to put on the table, though, that the Lord's Prayer was, thy kingdom come here on earth as it is in heaven, right? So there's an idea that I think there have been swaths of Christianity that have been so focused on the, whatever, on heaven or what, what do they say, like, so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. I feel like that's on some plaque in my grandmother's kitchen or something. She's dead, but, proverbial. But the idea of actually being very much a part of bringing the kingdom of God here on earth is central to Christianity too, and so I want to make sure we're not leaving that part out of the equation either.